For the first time in the Syrian conflict, a regime soldier has been prosecuted for a war crime. The evidence against him? A Facebook post. Mohammed Abdullah claimed asylum in Sweden in 2015, but activists recognized him from this online photo, smiling, surrounded by dead bodies. So instead of receiving refuge, he got an 8-month prison sentence for mistreating corpses. Now, the Syrian conflict has been going on for 6 years. So why is this the first time prosecutors got a conviction? Well, Yasser Tabara is here to help us answer that question. He's a senior fellow at the Omran Center for Strategic Studies and a former spokesman for the Syrian interim government. Yasser, good to have you on the program again. So, this guy, asylum seeker, Syria, goes to Sweden, Mohammed Abdullah. These activists, notify the authorities and he's locked up for 8 months. How important is this ruling?
Well, obviously 8 months for something so horrific that akin to basically a war crime is a little bit more than a slap on the face, on the wrist. However, I think considering that over the past 7 years you have hundreds of thousands of people that have been subjected to the most brutal of executions and war crimes, it is significant that this is the first incident of international accountability and end of impunity for these types of crimes. Do
you accept the judge's decision that you can't prove from the photograph unless he actually confesses that he actually killed anybody? Well, he was there. Yeah.
That is essentially the biggest problem in prosecuting in countries that have very little connection to the crime that took place, that the act took place at. And as we know, Sweden and Germany and now other European countries, including Switzerland, they're activating this universal jurisdiction aspect of their criminal justice system. And so that is the sort of the weak link of universal jurisdiction, the inability to collect evidence, the inability to go through the chain of custody of evidence and interview witnesses and be on the scene of the crime to be able to collect the type of data that is required to come to a conviction. And so, yes, I do sympathize with the Swedish judge for not being able to give more. I don't know the particulars of the case. I wasn't part of the legal team or anything like that. But from what I've read, it is extremely difficult to actually achieve a conviction of a crime of that magnitude without having the collection of evidence. And I think that is the responsibility of the international community. That has been the responsibility of the international community, considering the inaccess that they have been given by the Assad regime to Syrian land.
Yeah, so we know the limitations of universal jurisdiction. It's very hard to actually investigate on the ground. But just in a general sense, 6 years on, for those who are asking, never mind the foot soldiers, what about the colonels, what about the generals? All these people who are part of this killing machine, if you like. Why has not a single person been prosecuted when you have hundreds of thousands of people who are dead?
That is the million-dollar question when it comes to international criminal justice. International criminal justice lacks enforceability, plain and simple, or it lacks objective enforceability, I should say, because it has always been throughout history victor's justice when it comes to prosecutions of war crimes and things of that nature. The Russians, for example, and the Chinese have been putting the main obstacle in front of the referral of the Syria investigation to the International Criminal Court, which is the body that supposedly has the jurisdiction over the war crimes and crimes against humanity and other crimes that have been committed in Syria over the past 7 years. And that is purely because of political reasons and political posturing. And I think that international criminal law will always be held hostage to these considerations, and it has been in Syria for the past 7 years.
Interestingly, on the other side of the coin, if you like, if you put Assad's regime away and we look at the other side, we've seen life sentences, when it came to people who were convicted of killing or executing regime soldiers. So we saw it in Sweden, we saw it in Austria as well. With one guy, it was a video. So there was video evidence where the other guy, it was a confession during his immigration discussion. So we had these asylum seekers. Now, they weren't Daesh members, but they joined other extremist rebel groups, and they confessed to or were found to have killed or executed Syrian regime soldiers. When those guys get life sentences, do you feel that is just?
Well, again, I mean, that's something that, the legal process is an extremely technical process, and it's a very complex process. And so one cannot make any of these determinations unless they look at the evidence and evaluate it for themselves. I assume that for those types of cases, ample evidence a lot more evidence was provided than the case of Mohammed Abdullah that we saw conclude last week. But what I would like to do is just take a few steps back and take a look at the larger picture. You have now European governments and you have now international community speaking of rehabilitating or bringing the Assad regime back into the international fold. And as you said, forget about these foot soldiers. I mean, prosecuting someone like Mohammed Abdullah is akin to prosecuting a guard at Auschwitz when the generals roam free. What really needs to happen is for these types of cases to send a clear signal to the European governments, to the politicians, to the international community that engaging with the Assad regime when they have enabled and have directly committed and systematically committed these horrific human rights violations and this violation of international humanitarian law and international criminal law will come with a cost. And hopefully that these types of cases, these types of convictions, small as they may be, could be somewhat of a deterrence of these political processes of rehabilitating the Assad regime and its cohorts.
But there are those who would say that's not rehabilitation of the Assad regime; it's just getting a deal, no matter how bad it is. If it includes Assad, it puts out the fire.
Well, at least we could leverage the issue of accountability to end the human rights abuses that are taking place as we speak.
Right.
Tens of thousands of detainees still suffer in Assad prisons. We have thousands of detainees that are being tortured to death as we speak. And so I think a lot of that could be, look, it has to be part of a comprehensive political package. If we're going in the direction of ending the hostilities and sacrificing a lot of the rights and a lot of the concepts of justice that have really been violated over the past 7 years, then at least we would want to do it in a way that would produce freedom and positive results for those who are suffering as we speak.
Right, and you've been speaking about the big picture and the politics of it all. If you'll allow me very finally to kind of go granular again and go back to the base level of this with the foot soldiers. In a country with conscription, and we've read about, for example, Alawites who have been trying to dodge the draft and leave the country and so on. In a country with conscription, what's your take on those who might be fleeing, who might have been soldiers, who might not have committed any war crimes, but who were Syrian regime soldiers at a time when the regime was committing terrible acts and are trying to get into Europe? Do you think they should be given asylum?
Well, again, it depends on what they act on their own volition and what they were forced to do. This is, as you know, the asylum seeking process in Europe and a lot of these European countries is very stringent, and they go under a lot of scrutiny and a lot of basically detailed questions as to what groups they belong to, what acts that they have committed, the circumstances around them seeking asylum. But yes, obviously, within the tenets of international criminal law, if you are a foot soldier and you were forced to do something that is contrary to ethics and human rights, then it is your commander that is held responsible for that act more than the foot soldier themselves. So yes, I think those things must be taken into consideration, and these people have to be given due process and due diligence.
Will there only really be true justice once the war is over?
I highly doubt that. You know, the history of international criminal justice shows us that it was always a product or a function of the victorious politics of the time. And so there are many mechanisms that we can move forward in that potentially can deliver, you know, partial justice, that can deliver a certain measure of transitional peace and transitional tranquility. But to attain absolute justice is something that as Syrians, I think most Syrians have give up on. Just seeing how the dynamics of the international powers have played out in the past 7 years, especially in the past couple of years, where you have a major international power that, as we speak, has been committing war crimes by using air force in different parts of Syria. So how do you reconcile that with a transitional process that actually seeks accountability? I'm not sure.
Yasser Tabbara, always a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers.
Thank you.